Have you ever wondered how weddings were celebrated in the time of Jesus? What did they mean for the life, faith, and culture of the biblical people? In this documentary, you will discover what weddings were like 2,000 years ago according to the Bible and history. How did people who lived in the time of Jesus understand marriage? To answer this question, we need to travel to the heart of the first-century Jewish world, a context deeply shaped by faith, tradition, and community life. Marriage was not merely a personal decision or a romantic act as we often imagine it today. It was a central institution that upheld the social, economic, and spiritual structure of the people of Israel. In the Jewish world of Jesus' time, marriage was considered a sacred obligation. Not marrying was not the norm, and in many cases it was viewed with suspicion. The reason was clear. From the book of Genesis, God had established the command to be fruitful and multiply, and forming a family was understood as a direct way to obey the divine will. Marriage, therefore, was not seen only as a union between two people, but as an act of faithfulness to God and continuity for the chosen people. Jewish society was eminently patriarchal. The family was the basic unit of social life and was headed by the father, who held the legal, economic, and spiritual responsibility for the household. Important decisions, including the marriage of children, usually went through him. This does not mean that feelings did not matter, but rather that they were subordinated to broader family, social, and religious interests. Marriage was understood as an alliance between two families, not only between a man and a woman. When a couple united, their lineages, property, and reputation were linked as well. That is why the negotiations prior to marriage were so important. The family's honor, faithfulness to the law, economic stability, and position within the community were evaluated. All of this sought to ensure that the new family would integrate solidly into the life of the people. Women held a fundamental place in this structure, though very different from what we know today. Their social identity was closely tied to marriage and motherhood. An unmarried adult woman was an exception, and infertility was experienced as a great misfortune, sometimes even as a sign of divine disapproval. Nevertheless, within the home, women had considerable influence. They managed domestic life, passed on the faith to their children, and maintained daily traditions, such as dietary laws and religious celebrations. Men, for their part, bore the responsibility to provide and protect. Getting married meant taking on very concrete legal commitments, to feed, clothe, and care for one's wife. Marriage was not a fragile or improvised bond. The law of Moses regulated many of its aspects, establishing clear rights and duties for both parties, something that, for its time, offered a certain protection especially to women. Religion permeated every dimension of marriage. There was no separation between the sacred and the ordinary. Married life was part of God's plan, and for that reason it was surrounded by blessings, prayers, and symbolism. To marry was to enter into a covenant, a central concept in Jewish faith. Just as God had made a covenant with Israel, marriage was seen as a covenant between husband and wife, with God as witness. The community also played a key role. Marriage was not a private event but a public one. Everyone knew who was getting married, to whom, and under what conditions. This created a strong sense of responsibility and belonging. The couple was not alone. They were supported, observed, and in a sense safeguarded by the community. This environment helped maintain marital stability, but it also exerted social pressure to meet established expectations. It is important to understand that love, as we conceive of it today, was not the starting point of marriage, but often its result. Affection, respect, and intimacy were cultivated over time within the commitment that had been assumed. This does not mean there was no tenderness or attraction, but marriage did not depend on changing emotions. It rested on a shared life project backed by faith. Jesus grew up and lived in this context. His teachings on marriage, fidelity, and divorce did not arise in a vacuum. They dialogued with this deeply rooted vision within Jewish tradition. When he spoke of marriage as a union that should not be broken, he was reinforcing the idea of a sacred covenant. When he used wedding imagery in his parables, he knew everyone understood the depth of that language. Understanding how marriage was viewed in the first-century Jewish world allows us to read the Gospels with new eyes. It helps us understand why weddings carried so much symbolic weight, why Jesus chose a wedding to perform his first sign, and why the image of bridegroom and bride runs throughout the Bible. Marriage was not a simple social event. It was a reflection of the relationship between God and his people, a small story pointing to a much greater one. And with this clear foundation, We are now ready to delve into one of the most important moments of the ancient marriage process, the betrothal or engagement, a stage filled with legal, social, and spiritual meaning that marked the true beginning of marriage in the time of Jesus. What did it really mean to be betrothed in the time of Jesus? Today, when we talk about engagement, we usually think of a ring, a romantic proposal, and a pre-wedding period that can be broken off relatively easily. But in the first-century Jewish world, the engagement, known as betrothal or kiddushin, was far more than a promise. It was a legal, public, and deeply sacred act that, in many ways, already constituted marriage. Betrothal was the first formal stage of Jewish marriage. From that moment on, the couple was considered legally united, even though they did not yet live together and had not consummated the relationship. This stage could last several months and even up to a year, and during that time the bond was so serious that it could be dissolved only through a formal act of divorce. For that reason, breaking a betrothal was no small matter. It carried very important social, legal, and religious consequences. This detail is key to understanding many biblical passages. For example, when the Gospels say that Mary was betrothed to Joseph, this was not a simple courtship. Mary and Joseph were already legally bound. That is why, when Joseph discovers that Mary is pregnant, the text states that he thought about divorcing her quietly. It is not about ending an informal relationship, but about confronting a situation that, under the law, could carry extremely serious consequences. The betrothal process generally began with an agreement between families. The father of the groom negotiated with the father of the bride the conditions of the marriage. These negotiations included the bride price, that is, the value the groom or his family paid to the bride's family. Far from being a purchase, the bride price functioned as an economic guarantee for the woman, a kind of security that protected her in case of divorce or widowhood. In a society where women depended economically on the household, this element was fundamental. Once the agreement was reached, a formal betrothal ceremony took place. It was not as festive as the final wedding, but it was solemn. It included the presence of witnesses, blessings, and a public declaration of the commitment. It was often sealed with the gift of a valuable object, such as a coin, symbolizing the legal union. From that moment, the woman was set apart for the man, and both assumed mutual duties before the law and before God. During the betrothal period, the couple did not live together. The bride remained in her father's house, and the groom returned to his. This separation did not mean emotional distance, but preparation. The groom had to prepare a place to receive his wife, usually by expanding the family home. The bride, for her part, prepared for her new role, learning and refining household tasks and the responsibilities she would assume as a wife. This period was filled with expectation and symbolism. Betrothal was a time of absolute fidelity. Any unfaithfulness during this stage was considered adultery, with all the moral and legal implications that entailed. The seriousness of the commitment reinforced the idea that marriage was not based on passing emotions, but on a firm decision supported by the community. The language of betrothal was also deeply connected to faith. The word kiddushin comes from a Hebrew root meaning to consecrate or to sanctify. By becoming betrothed, the couple set themselves apart for God, recognizing that their union had a higher purpose than simple cohabitation. Marriage thus began with an act of holiness, not with a social celebration. This concept helps explain why the prophets of the Old Testament so often used the image of betrothal to describe the relationship between God and Israel. God is presented as a faithful husband who betroths his people, and idolatry is described as infidelity. For those living in the time of Jesus, these images were not abstract metaphors, but deeply familiar experiences. Betrothal also marked a change in social status. A betrothed woman was no longer considered single, though she did not yet live as a wife. She dressed differently, behaved according to her new state, and was publicly recognized as belonging to her future husband. This public recognition protected her honor and set clear boundaries in her relationship with other men. One of the most fascinating aspects of betrothal is how it sheds light on Jesus' words in the Gospels. When Jesus speaks of the bridegroom who goes away and then returns, or of the virgins waiting for the groom with their lamps lit, he is directly referencing this stage of marriage. His listeners understood the image perfectly: the groom who leaves to prepare a place and then returns unexpectedly to take the bride. This cultural background also explains the importance of waiting. The bride did not know exactly the day or the hour when the groom would return for the final wedding. She had to be ready at all times. This constant expectation becomes a powerful spiritual teaching in Jesus' words, as he uses the language of betrothal to speak of vigilance, faithfulness, and hope. Betrothal, therefore, was not a simple preliminary formality. It was the heart of marital commitment. In many ways, it was more important than the final celebration, because it established the covenant. The public wedding and the banquet celebrated something that had already been decided and sealed beforehand. Understanding this stage changes the way we read the biblical story. It allows us to better grasp the human and spiritual drama experienced by Mary and Joseph, the depth of Jesus' parables, and the way marriage reflected the relationship between God and his people. Betrothal speaks to us of commitment, waiting, faithfulness, and preparation, values that remain deeply relevant today. And with this context in mind, we can move on to the next moment of marriage in the time of Jesus. The wedding preparations, a stage full of symbolism, work, and expectation, which would culminate in one of the most important events of community life. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. What really happened between the engagement and the big wedding day in the time of Jesus? For many today, wedding preparations boil down to choosing a venue, sending invitations, and organizing a party. However, in the first-century Jewish world, this period was an intense stage, full of work, symbolism, and deep spiritual expectation. The preparations did not merely organize an event, they prepared an entire life. After the betrothal, a waiting period began that could last several months. This time was not passive or improvised. The groom took on one of the most important responsibilities of the entire marriage process, preparing a place where the new family could live. Normally, this meant building or fitting out an additional room in the father's house. Homes were often expanded as sons married, forming family compounds in which several generations lived together. Thus, marriage not only united two people, but also reinforced the structure of the clan. This cultural detail casts special light on Jesus' well-known words about going to prepare a place. For his listeners, the image was clear and everyday. The groom would be absent while he worked, built, and made everything ready. Only when the father considered the house prepared would he authorize the son's return to fetch his wife. This element reinforced the idea of patience and trust during the wait. Meanwhile, the bride also lived her own process of preparation. She remained in her father's house, surrounded by the women of the family who instructed and accompanied her. She learned and refined domestic tasks, but she also prepared emotionally and spiritually for her new role. The wedding did not mean only moving house, but taking on a new identity within the community. The bride's preparation included caring for her clothing and the items she would bring to the new home. The wedding dress was not an extravagant luxury, but it was a special garment reserved exclusively for that moment. In many families, it was passed down from generation to generation, adding a strong sense of continuity and tradition. Every detail carried symbolic and emotional value. During this time, the waiting was marked by vigilance. The bride did not know the exact day the groom would return to take her. She had to be ready at all times. This constant state of expectation was an essential part of the experience. Lamps had to be ready, the heart prepared, and the house set for the unexpected moment. This cultural reality is the background to one of Jesus' best-known parables, the young women waiting for the bridegroom with their lamps lit. Preparations also involved the community. Although the exact date was not always announced far in advance, everyone knew a wedding was approaching. Neighbors, friends, and relatives remained attentive. The wedding was a collective event, not a private one. When the moment finally arrived, the whole town participated in some way, whether in the procession, the banquet, or the songs and celebrations. The waiting, however, was not without tensions. The family's honor was at stake. Any rumor, unjustified delay, or inappropriate behavior could generate suspicion or conflict. For that reason, fidelity during this time was crucial. The couple lived under the watchful eye of the community, which reinforced the seriousness of the commitment and the importance of maintaining blameless conduct. The groom, in addition to preparing the house, had to ensure he had the necessary resources to support his future wife. This meant working, saving, and demonstrating that he was able to assume the responsibility of marriage. It was not enough to desire to marry, one had to be ready to do so. This principle was deeply rooted in Jewish culture and gave marriage a stable and lasting character. The preparations culminated when everything was ready. But even then, the exact moment remained uncertain for the bride. The groom often arrived at night, accompanied by friends and with music, announcing his arrival with voices and festive sounds. This element of surprise made the waiting even more meaningful. It was not merely about awaiting an event, but living in a constant state of readiness. This waiting period also carried strong spiritual meaning. Preparing for marriage was, in a sense, preparing to fulfill God's will. Each everyday action took on a deeper significance. The wait was not empty time, but a season of growth, maturity, and trust. In this context, patience became an essential virtue. By understanding wedding preparations in the time of Jesus, we better understand why waiting occupies such a central place in his teachings. It was not an abstract idea, but an experience lived by everyone. Waiting for the groom was a powerful image that spoke of hope, fidelity, and commitment. And when the groom finally returned and the waiting came to an end, the most visible and celebrated moment of marriage began. The wedding ceremony, an experience full of symbolism, joy, and deep communal meaning, which we will explore next. What was the exact moment like when waiting ended and married life officially began in the time of Jesus? The wedding ceremony, known as Nissu'in, was the visible heart of the first-century Jewish wedding. It was not merely a formal act, but a deeply emotional experience, filled with symbols, music, light, and community participation. It was the moment when everything prepared for months became reality before everyone's eyes. The ceremony began with the groom's arrival. This moment was awaited with great expectation, especially by the bride, who did not know the exact day or hour. The groom did not arrive alone. He came accompanied by friends and relatives, forming a festive procession that moved through the village streets. People sang, played simple instruments, and announced loudly that the bridegroom was coming. Night, far from being an inconvenience, added a solemn and almost sacred character to the moment, illuminated by torches and oil lamps. When the procession reached the bride's home, she came out to meet him. This gesture marked the end of the waiting period and the beginning of the visible union. The bride was prepared, dressed in her finest clothes, adorned with family jewelry, and accompanied by friends who also carried lit lamps. She was not a passive figure. Her coming out symbolized her consent and readiness to begin a new life. After the meeting, the procession toward the groom's house, or toward the place where the ceremony would be held, began. This journey had special meaning. It represented the bride's passage from one family to another, from one stage of life to the next. The whole village could join this procession, turning the wedding into a collective event. There was no idea of a private wedding. Marriage was a matter for the entire community. Upon arriving at the place of the ceremony, formal blessings were pronounced. These blessings acknowledged God as the source of the union and asked for his favor upon the new family. Marriage did not begin only with human words, but under divine invocation. The presence of witnesses was essential, as it guaranteed the public and legal character of the act. The marriage was thus recognized before God and before people. One of the central elements of the ceremony was the shared home. Unlike modern weddings, where the ceremony and the celebration are often separated from the start of cohabitation, in the time of Jesus, the Nissu'in marked the moment when the couple began to live together. Marriage became effective not only through words, but through the wife's incorporation into the husband's household. Joy was a dominant feature of this moment. The wedding was seen as a blessing for the whole community. Songs, dances, and expressions of gladness were not excesses, but a legitimate way to celebrate a sacred event. Sadness and mourning were set aside. Even certain religious obligations were relaxed to allow the celebration to be complete. The joy of the bride and groom became the joy of the people. The symbolism of light held a prominent place. Lamps and torches did not merely illuminate the night, they represented life, blessing, and God's presence. Being prepared with a lit lamp was not a minor detail, but a sign of readiness and vigilance. This image, so familiar to Jesus' contemporaries, becomes a powerful metaphor in his teachings. The ceremony was also marked by words of exhortation and wisdom. Elders or respected figures might offer counsel about fidelity, mutual respect, and responsibility. Marriage was not idealized as an easy path, but as an alliance that required effort and commitment. These words helped the couple understand the seriousness of the step they were taking. The public character of the ceremony protected the woman and affirmed her dignity. By being publicly recognized as a wife, her status was clear before everyone. This carried not only symbolic value, but also legal and social weight. The ceremony ensured the union was not secret or ambiguous, preventing future conflicts and securing family stability. For Jesus listeners, the wedding ceremony was a deeply familiar experience. That is why when Jesus spoke of the bridegroom, the wedding banquet, or the joy of marriage, he was not using distant images. He was appealing to shared memories, emotions, and expectations. His words resonated because they rested on real and meaningful experiences. The wedding ceremony also marked a before and after in the spouses' lives. From that moment on, they no longer belonged only to themselves, but to each other and to the new family they were forming. The community recognized this change and adjusted its relationship with the couple accordingly. Marriage reorganized social relationships and strengthened communal bonds. This solemn and festive moment was not the end, but the beginning. After the ceremony, the celebration continued with the wedding banquet, a feast that could last several days and that tangibly expressed the abundance, hospitality, and joy proper to marriage. But even before reaching the banquet, the ceremony had already made one fundamental point clear. Marriage was a sacred covenant, lived with joy, responsibility, and deep spiritual awareness. Understanding how the wedding ceremony unfolded in the time of Jesus allows us to better appreciate the richness of biblical images and the depth of his teachings. It shows us that marriage was not a mere contract nor a superficial celebration, but an event that united heaven and earth, faith and daily life, community and personal commitment. And with this living picture before us, we are ready to delve into the next stage, the wedding banquet, where joy reached its fullest expression and the celebration extended to the entire community. Why was the wedding banquet the most remembered and anticipated moment of the entire marriage celebration in the time of Jesus? For people in the first-century Jewish world, the banquet was not a simple add-on to the ceremony, but the climax of the celebration, the space where joy overflowed and where marriage became visible in all its social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions. If the ceremony sealed the union, the banquet proclaimed it before everyone. The wedding banquet began immediately after the ceremony and could last for several days, sometimes even a full week. In a society where daily life was simple and shaped by hard work, such a prolonged celebration was extraordinary. That is why weddings became unforgettable events. During those days, the village practically paused to celebrate with the couple. The groom's home, or the designated place for the celebration, was transformed into an open and welcoming space. There were no closed guest lists as today. Relatives, friends, neighbors, and even travelers could participate. Hospitality was a central value, and a wedding was the ideal occasion to practice it. Turning someone away who approached the banquet would have been seen as a serious dishonor. Food played a central role in the celebration. Preparing a banquet for so many guests required a huge investment of time and resources. The groom's family assumed this responsibility, making the banquet a public demonstration of generosity and capability. It was not empty showiness, but the fulfillment of a deeply rooted social expectation. A wedding had to be abundant. Wine was indispensable. More than a drink, it symbolized joy, blessing, and life. Running out of wine during a wedding banquet was a social catastrophe, a shame that could mark the family for years. This cultural detail is essential for understanding the importance of Jesus' first sign at a wedding, where the problem was not minor or trivial, but profoundly significant for the hosts. Along with food and wine, the banquet included music, songs, and dancing. It was not a silent or restrained celebration. Joy was expressed visibly and audibly. Traditional songs evoked blessings, prosperity, and fruitfulness for the new couple. Music helped create a festive atmosphere that reinforced the idea that marriage was a blessing for the whole community. During the banquet, the newlyweds held a special place. They were the focus of attention, but not as passive spectators. They received congratulations, blessings, and good wishes. The community publicly expressed its support and its hope for the future of the new family. This collective recognition strengthened the marital bond and reminded the couple they did not walk alone. The banquet also served as a space of implicit teaching. Through gestures, words, and traditions, fundamental values were transmitted: the importance of generosity, shared joy, respect for the community, and gratitude to God. Eating together was not a trivial act, but an expression of communion. Sharing the table meant sharing life. One of the most interesting aspects of the wedding banquet is its inclusive character. Unlike other, more restricted celebrations, the wedding opened its doors to everyone. This explains why Jesus so often used the image of the wedding banquet to speak of the kingdom of God. For his listeners, the idea of an open, abundant banquet filled with joy was the best way to imagine a perfect and desirable reality. The banquet celebrated not only the union of the spouses, but also the continuity of life. Marriage was seen as the beginning of a new fruitful stage, open to children and to the future. Eating and drinking together was a way of anticipating that expected abundance. For that reason, the tone of the banquet was decidedly optimistic, even in a social context where hardships were common. The length of the banquet allowed the celebration to unfold without haste. It was not an event of a few hours, but an extended time of fellowship. This duration strengthened communal ties, allowed tensions to be resolved, friendships to be renewed, and family relationships to be reinforced. The wedding thus became a space of reconciliation and social renewal. The family's honor was deeply tied to the success of the banquet. A well-organized, generous, joyful celebration raised the prestige of the groom's family. Conversely, a poorly prepared wedding could be remembered as a source of shame. This social pressure explained the extreme care in preparation and the anxiety that could arise from any unforeseen problem. The banquet also marked a shift in the relationship between the couple and the community. From that moment on, they were publicly recognized as a new family unit. The community adjusted its expectations and its treatment of them. The banquet, therefore, was not only a party, but a rite of passage that consolidated a new social reality. Underlying all of this was a spiritual dimension. Though festive, the banquet was not separated from faith. Blessings to God, recognition of His providence, and gratitude for life were part of the atmosphere. Joy was not seen as superficial, but as a legitimate expression of divine blessing. Understanding the centrality of the wedding banquet in the time of Jesus helps us grasp the force of His words when He spoke of the kingdom as a banquet, the need to be prepared to enter, or the danger of despising the invitation. For His listeners, these images were not abstract, but deeply concrete and emotionally charged. The wedding banquet was, ultimately, the fullest expression of marital joy. It brought the community together, celebrated life, strengthened social bonds, and proclaimed God's blessing upon the couple. It was a moment where the human and the divine met around the table, reminding everyone that marriage not only united two people, but renewed the whole community. And from this experience of overflowing celebration, we can take one more step and explore how weddings appear in the Gospels and in Jesus' teachings, where these familiar images become profound spiritual messages that still speak powerfully today. Why do weddings appear again and again in the Gospels and in Jesus' teachings? Far from being a simple cultural detail, the image of the wedding and the wedding banquet holds a central place in Jesus' message. This is no accident. Jesus spoke to people who deeply understood the meaning of a wedding, people who had participated in nighttime processions, who had waited for the groom, who had celebrated long and costly banquets. By using the language of weddings, Jesus connected His message to real experiences filled with emotion, expectation, and communal meaning. One of the best-known episodes is the wedding at Cana. It is not merely the setting where Jesus performs His first sign, but a carefully chosen context. A wedding was the place where joy was meant to be complete. When the wine runs out, the situation is not a minor inconvenience, but a threat to the family's honor and to the very meaning of the celebration. By intervening, Jesus not only solves a practical problem, but restores the joy and abundance expected of a well-celebrated wedding. The message is clear: with His presence, lack becomes fullness. This episode shows how Jesus inserted Himself into the everyday life of His people. He does not perform His first sign in the temple or in a solemn act, but at a wedding, in the middle of a family celebration. This reveals a very important dimension of His message. Faith is not separate from daily life. God acts in the most human moments, even in a celebration full of food, music, and joy. Later, Jesus repeatedly uses the image of the bridegroom to speak of Himself. When He is questioned about why His disciples do not fast, He responds that one cannot fast while the bridegroom is present. This comparison only makes sense in a culture where a wedding is the greatest symbol of joy. The presence of the bridegroom transforms the atmosphere. With these words, Jesus affirms that His arrival inaugurates a new time, a time of celebration, not mourning. Jesus' parables deepen this symbolism even further. One of the most famous is the parable of the young women who wait for the groom with their lamps. For His listeners, the scene was completely familiar. Everyone knew the groom could arrive at night and that it was necessary to be prepared. The parable does not speak merely of a wedding, but of watchfulness, faithfulness, and responsibility. Being ready was not optional. It was the difference between participating in the celebration or being left outside. Another powerful parable is that of the wedding banquet that many invited guests refused to attend. In this story, the refusal to come is not a minor breach of etiquette, but a serious offense. Rejecting the invitation meant despising the host's honor and breaking communal bonds. Jesus uses this image to confront those who do not recognize the importance of God's call, showing that the invitation remains open, even to those who are not considered worthy by social standards. These parables do not merely communicate moral teachings, they are charged with emotion. Jesus speaks of joy, waiting, frustration, and surprise. He uses the language of weddings because he knows it touches deep chords in his listeners' hearts. Everyone understands what it means to wait, to prepare, to celebrate, or to be left out. The constant use of wedding imagery also connects to an older tradition. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the relationship between God and Israel is frequently described in marital terms. God is presented as a faithful husband and the people as his wife. Jesus takes up this language and carries it a step further, placing himself at the center of that relationship. This did not go unnoticed by those who heard him. It was a profound claim about his identity and mission. Weddings in the Gospels also reveal Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God. He does not describe it as a cold or distant institution, but as a celebration, a banquet, a shared feast. The kingdom is presented not as a place of exclusion, but as an open table where joy is abundant. This image contrasts with more rigid or legalistic visions of faith, and it explains why Jesus' message was so attractive to many. At the same time, wedding images also include warnings. Not everyone enters the celebration automatically. One must respond to the invitation, be prepared, and assume responsibility for the call. The parables show that joy does not remove the seriousness of commitment. On the contrary, celebration demands a conscious response. Jesus uses wedding language to speak both of the present and of the future. Some parables point to a celebration that has not yet arrived, to a waiting that continues. This keeps alive the tension between what is already experienced and what is still hoped for. Faith is lived between the certainty of the invitation and the responsibility to remain ready. For Jesus' first followers, these images had a profound impact. They helped them understand their relationship with God not only in terms of obedience, but of communion, joy, and hope. Faith was not merely keeping rules, but responding to an invitation to participate in a greater celebration. Understanding how Jesus uses weddings in his teaching enables us to read the Gospels more deeply. It helps us catch nuances that might otherwise go unnoticed and to see why these images have endured for centuries. They are not merely ancient stories, but messages that still challenge the reader and listener. Weddings in the Gospels are not just background scenery. They are a living language that speaks of relationship, commitment, joy, and hope. Jesus took one of the most meaningful human experiences of his time and turned it into a key for understanding God's message. And it is precisely that closeness to real life that makes his words still resonate so strongly today. From here, the path leads us to a deeper reflection, the spiritual and prophetic symbolism of marriage, a dimension that runs through the entire Bible and finds an especially rich and transformative expression in Jesus' words. Why does the Bible so often use marriage to speak of the relationship between God and humanity? This question brings us to the heart of the spiritual and prophetic symbolism that runs through Scripture from beginning to end. In the biblical world, marriage was not only a social institution, but a powerful image to express commitment, faithfulness, love, and hope. That is why, when biblical authors wanted to explain God's relationship with his people, they returned again and again to wedding language. In Old Testament texts, God is frequently presented as the husband and Israel as the wife. This image does not arise by chance. Marriage was the strongest and most stable human bond people knew, and describing the relationship with God in those terms helped convey its depth and exclusivity. God does not present himself as a distant ruler, but as a husband who loves, protects, and cares for his people. The prophets developed this language with extraordinary force. They spoke of the betrothal between God and Israel, of the faithfulness expected, and of infidelity that caused pain. Idolatry, that is, abandoning God for other gods, is described as adultery. This comparison was not exaggerated or overly poetic. It was the clearest way to express the seriousness of breaking a sacred covenant. But alongside denunciations, the prophets also announced restoration. They spoke of a new betrothal, of renewed love, of a healed relationship. God promises to betroth His people again in faithfulness and justice, not because of human merit, but out of love. This future hope keeps alive the image of marriage as a path of reconciliation and renewal. This background is essential for understanding Jesus' message. When Jesus speaks of the bridegroom, He does not introduce a new idea. He stands within a long tradition. Yet there is a decisive turn. Jesus presents Himself as the bridegroom. This carries enormous weight. To place oneself in the role of the husband is to assume the role that, in Scripture, belonged to God Himself. In the New Testament, the image of marriage is expanded and deepened. The community of believers is presented as the bride, called to live in faithfulness and hope. The relationship is no longer limited to one specific people, but opens to all. The invitation to the wedding banquet extends beyond cultural and religious boundaries. Marriage symbolism also introduces the idea of waiting. Just as the bride waits for the groom, the community awaits the fullness of the relationship. This waiting is not passive or resigned, but active and watchful. Preparing, remaining faithful, and living according to the commitment assumed becomes a concrete way of living faith. One of the most powerful elements of this symbolism is the image of the future wedding. The story does not end with betrothal or waiting, but with the final celebration. The Bible culminates with the image of a wedding, where the union between God and His people is fully realized. Faith is oriented toward that hope, toward a joy that has not yet been fully revealed. This wedding language also reveals the relational character of biblical faith. God does not seek a relationship based only on rules or rituals, but on love and mutual commitment. Marriage, with all its demands and promises, becomes the best reflection of this relationship. Faithfulness, self-giving, and perseverance are not abstract ideas, but concrete experiences drawn from everyday life. The prophetic symbolism of marriage also challenges the believing community. To be a bride implies responsibility. It is not enough to have been invited. One must respond to the invitation. The image of the wedding garment, for example, speaks of the need to live according to the dignity received. Faith is not only a gift, but also a call to coherence. This language remains deeply relevant today. Speaking of faith as a marital relationship allows us to understand it in a more human and accessible way. It is not only about believing certain ideas, but about living a relationship that involves love, commitment, and hope. Marriage symbolism translates the divine into a language that is understandable and emotionally meaningful. By understanding the spiritual and prophetic symbolism of marriage, we discover that weddings in the time of Jesus were not just social events, but windows into a deeper reality. Every gesture, every wait, every celebration pointed to something greater. Marriage became a living parable of God's plan for humanity. And with this deeper understanding, we are ready to look at our own time and ask what we can learn today from weddings in the era of Jesus. What aspects we have lost and which still carry a value that transcends the centuries. What can weddings celebrated more than 2,000 years ago teach us today? At first glance, weddings from the time of Jesus seem very far removed from our reality. Different customs, different social roles, and a way of life that no longer exists. Yet by comparing them with today's weddings, we find that many of their key insights remain surprisingly relevant and invite us to reflect on how we understand marriage, commitment, and community today. One of the most obvious differences is the central role of the community. In the time of Jesus, a wedding was not a private event or an exclusive celebration for a select few. It was a collective occasion that involved entire families and, in many cases, the whole village. Today, although weddings remain important celebrations, they are often experienced in a more individualistic way, focused almost exclusively on the couple. This comparison invites us to ask what we have gained and what we have lost by reducing the community's role. Another important difference lies in how commitment is understood. In the ancient world, marriage began with a firm decision, supported by family and community, and emotions were cultivated within that commitment. Today, by contrast, we often emphasize feelings as the primary foundation of the union. Love is valued as something that must be strongly felt before committing. Both visions have strengths and weaknesses, but the comparison reminds us that commitment can be the ground where love grows and strengthens, not only a result of emotion. The importance of waiting is also striking. In weddings of Jesus' time, waiting was an essential part of the process. The time between betrothal and the wedding was filled with preparation, expectation, and growth. In our current culture, marked by immediacy, we tend to reduce waiting times to a minimum. Everything must happen quickly. Looking back, we can rediscover the value of slow, conscious processes, where each stage has its purpose. Symbolism is another point of contrast. Ancient weddings were full of symbolic gestures that conveyed deep values: the light of lamps, the nighttime procession, the shared banquet. Today, although many weddings retain symbols, these can sometimes become merely decorative and lose their original meaning. Comparing both eras invites us to recover the significance of symbols and ask what we truly want to express through them. However, there are also similarities that transcend the centuries. Joy remains the heart of the wedding. Both then and now, a wedding is a celebration of life, love, and hope. The desire to share that moment with others, to gather loved ones around a table, remains deeply human. In this, modern and ancient weddings meet. The comparison also helps us value positive changes. Today there is greater freedom in choosing a spouse and a clearer recognition of the dignity and rights of both partners. These transformations reflect important social progress. Looking to the past does not mean idealizing it, but learning from it, recognizing both its limits and its lessons. By viewing weddings in the time of Jesus from our current perspective, we see that it is not about copying ancient customs, but about recovering principles. The value of commitment, the importance of community, the richness of symbolism, and the meaning of celebration are elements that can enrich how we understand marriage today. This comparison leaves us with an open question: what kind of weddings and commitments do we want to build in our time? By reflecting on the past, we do not only learn history, we find keys to living our own relationships with greater depth and meaning. As we have explored what weddings were like in the time of Jesus, we have discovered that they were not merely ancient celebrations, but experiences full of meaning, faith, and community. Every gesture, every wait, and every banquet speaks to us of commitment, hope, and joy, values that remain profoundly current. Understanding these weddings helps us better understand the Bible and Jesus' message within its real and human context. If this documentary has helped you see Scripture with new eyes, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your participation helps us keep creating content that goes deeper into faith, history, and the Bible. Thank you for joining us until the end.